Okay, so let's talk a bit about topic 7, network security. So some of the things we're going to be talking about in here is different kinds of network security vulnerabilities, ways to identify different solutions to those vulnerabilities. They can be applied at different layers, um, different network security topologies, and specifically some stuff dealing with Wi-Fi wireless LAN vulnerabilities and solutions. Okay. So this is dealing with from the book. Actually, a couple different sources here. From the Security Plus Essentials, sections 4.1 through 4.7, 8.8, and 11, and also chapter 7, where we talk about in the Marsic book, talking about quality of service. So we talked around this idea of security. The fundamentals of security. If you talk to a security professional, the watchword or kind of the central concept around is what we call the CIA triad. So it's confidentiality, CIA standing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is making sure information is not disclosed to unauthorized individuals. Integrity is making sure that the data you work with is consistent and correct and is has not been modified. And then finally, availability is making sure that you know two things. Number one is legitimate users are not denied access to information, and that also that illegitimate users are not provided access. All right, so these are the three kind of core tenets of security. So that makes up what, as we call it, the CIA triad. The idea of you can add to that this idea of authorized use, kind of uh, kind of along the lines of illegitimate users. Basically resources are not to be used by unauthorized users or in unauthorized ways. So this really kind of provides the framework, kind of the overall end to end of what security is focused on. So from a communication perspective, there's a challenge because what happens is, security is reasonably straightforward so long as, a computer is in a room and is not and access to the computer is within it, say within a locked room. You can physically secure it. Challenge is uh, if you send information or data uh, outside of the computer, which is the essence of what a network does. How do you provide um, secure, confidential communications? That's really kind of the essence of this network security issue. So the idea is you want to be able to send the content, basically take a message, um, package it up in such a fashion so it can be transferred um, through an insecure across an insecure environment, received by the correct recipient, who can then unlock and read the information that was transferred. Right? So some of the things you need. So a couple things you need around that. This idea of of a key and encryption, and kind of a shared messages. This is really kind of the overall concept when we're talking about network security. So there's a whole bunch of different types of attacks. This is one of the this is the world that network managers live in. So things we see things of basically using existing elements or attributes of a network against itself. So things like a ping flood, which is basically uses ICMP, which is a piece of TCP/IP, a protocol within TCP/IP to basically flood a machine with all sorts of requests and basically making the machine unavailable. So that's what they call ping flood. Um, Smurfing is another one, which is kind of another variant of that. Um, a little bit of a variant. So what it'll do is it'll send ping requests to all the broadcast address. So everything will, so not just simply send it to a single machine, but sent to everything on the broadcast network and overloading routers. With the idea of both host and routers. So the idea is trying to, things that can be alleviated around that. Another well-known, well-established attack method is what we call basically leveraging the three-way TCP/IP handshake using what we call a TCP SYN flood, where the synchronization messages are sent en masse to a target, which will then which will then interfere with the operation of the targeted machine. A couple others, Fraggle, just like Smurf, except it uses UDP. Um, Land, which is a fake SYN packet containing the same source and destination address, and then send along, basically trying to confuse a recipient. Don't forget it on a network. A packet is just simply a collection of data, so you can create a fake packet and put it onto the network, just changing the fields, the content of the source, the destination, the port, things of that nature. Teardrop is kind of a fragmentation type of attack. Bonk is actually a window specifically on Windows, um, basically sending a modified UDP packets to DNS port to DNS, which will then result in a system crash. Similar to that is uh, um, similar to that is what we call a ping of death, where you send an ICMP packet, um, to certain types of machines, which can actually cause the machine to crash. Boink is a variant of Bonk. Instead of sending it to just the DNS port, it'll actually send it to multiple ports. Right? So you get a whole bunch of different ways of machines being attacked. So this is just kind of an example of what a TCP SYN might look like. Ways you mitigate it, basically limiting the number of half open connections. Yeah, that's how you can tell you're being attacked. Is that a you're getting synchronizations without the additional without the additional parts of the process, and be indicated by a large number of half open connections. Um, you can, you know, after the fact, you can block attacking address. You can identify the address where the attack is coming from, block that. Problem is being able to, it's always done after the fact, and an attacker will just simply move to another IP address. The IPv6 is basically has the three-way communication in TCP IPv6, basically alleviates this attack. So this is a IPv4 problem. So this is kind of ingress, one approach you ingress and filtering packets in and out before either stuff comes out or goes in. Now backdoor attacks are mechanisms that allow an attacker to get into the system without going through the normal authentication process. Um, a lot of these things are pre-built, established, and developed by developers. So part of the challenge in this is basically being able to um, in your software development processes to try to look for and evaluate and around from a code review and things of that nature. However, some of the better ones, some of the better known ones, something called back orifice. Um, Actually, a lot of times what these things will do, will look to exploit existing functions, like for example, administrative tasks, um, and because those are well known. So back orifice, netbus, sub7 all have kind of a similar thing. Basically, attacks that can be are kind of secretly included into software that which can then be exploited somewhere downstream. Spoofing addresses is basically, when we talk about spoofing, we talk about basically pretending that a system is a trusted system. Pretending to be something. So IP spoofing. We talk about IPv spoofing means to modify the data so that the originating address would be sent from an originating address, even though ordinarily it would be sent through be blocked through a firewall to prevent access. Um, DNS spoofing is where you basically use the DNS, because remember what DNS does is a DNS, it will basically translate uh, an address, basically a text address, www dot something to in a URL to an IP address. So the idea is what you do is you kind of pretend to be the DNS server and simply redirect it. So instead of receiving, the correct DNS address, what happens is that gets intercepted. A new result is placed into it, which will redirect the IP into a different direction. Man in the middle. Man in the middles are very well known, very well sophisticated um, types of attacks. Basically, what happens with man in the middle attack is that an attacker will place themselves between a host system and between the two systems, and will intercept traffic coming in, either read it, capture information, modify information, and then send it along to its destination. Between the two hosts, basically, there is no indication that anything was out of whack. All right. So what will happen is that you kind of sit by sitting in between, capturing information and just being able to kind of quietly sit there and gather information. Uh, you can do things like you can hijack sessions, you can replay sessions. And the idea of a replay session is you capture the information and then basically come back in later on and use that same information to get back into the machine. So things like, for example, by doing a replay attack, you can pretend that you're using that you're operating in a certain way, but the reality is you're emulating a previous communication path. And IP hijacking. So these are all what we call man-in-the-middle attacks. You know, there's application errors or application vulnerabilities. So DNS has vulnerabilities within it. HTTP response has vulnerabilities in it. There's ways. A lot of this stuff is in IPv4. So a lot of times, what will happen is, there's mitigations that need to be applied at IPv4, but will be resolved when we go to IPv6. And each layer. So the other thing to remember about a lot of these network vulnerabilities are that vulnerabilities can move up and down the stack. Right. So there's different things that can be used, across, moving from the application layer all the way down through the network layer into the physical layer. So each layer can potentially be attacked for different things. So you'll see different um, kinds of mitigations. There's different types of threats and different kinds of mitigations, each one relevant for each layer in the stack. So you'll see things like ARP, Address Resolution Protocol, which is a very well known, well used um, uh, form of attack. All right, so basically, it's a fairly well known attack vector. So you end up having all sorts of different, interesting, different ways of doing denial of service, different ways of doing man-in-the-middle attacks. Really what you need to have is an end-to-end communication. So the way a lot of these things get resolved is through having an encrypted end-to-end communication, basically from between two hosts, in which information cannot be intercepted in transit as things are passing across the network. So it's just an example of kind of how that looks, of what the kind of a path of using public key and using a combination of public key infrastructure and creating basically taking a message, encrypting it, passing it back and forth as it moves back and forth. Remember, the whole idea is this keyword, and once we look at this idea of the untrustworthy. Carriers are untrustworthy. All right, so what has to happen is you need to provide end-to-end security. Just another diagram related back to that around kind of how a public key and private key. Basically, you use encrypt using one key, decrypt using the other key. And sender authentication. So one thing is one of the risks you run if you don't do a um, mutual authentication, you become potentially vulnerable to a playback attack. Basically, information can be captured and replayed in, and what happens is the authentication is assumed um, on the recipient side, so therefore that could be subject to a vulnerability. Right? So the idea of the way you get around that is through what we call mutual authentication. Both parties need to authenticate with each other and then establish communication, establish secure and protected communications. Impersonation attack, another form of attack, basically being able to capturing information, then using the information later on downstream to um, playback. So one of the challenges you run into, especially with key management. Key management becomes a big challenge in network communication because obviously there are keys have to be distributed effectively in order to decrypt information. However, if those keys get intercepted somewhere along the line, then what will happen is information can be compromised. So we talked about IPv6. So V6 uh, basically has a feature built into it, which allows for creation of an authentication header or an encapsulated security payload, which basically protects information. So it's more built into um, the protocol. IPv6 has a much higher um, layer of security, or has more security features built into it that can be used for the protection of communication. So a couple things, neighbor discovery. There are, just because it has more doesn't mean that there's not a vulnerability. So one of the things you run into is neighbor discovery protocol, which is a feature of IPv6, which can be compromised similar to ARP. So just because you have you can have functionality and you have capabilities, and there's still ongoing, potential attacks that need to be thought of and identified and dealt with. So firewalls, the idea of a firewall, from a network perspective, it was one of the fundamental building blocks of network protocols, of network security. The idea of um, a communication, basically a device that sits in between the internet and an intranet and monitors packets and, and basically will prevent packets, invalid packets from passing through. So only things that are authenticated can pass through. So there's rules. The idea is that a firewall is programmable by establishing rules. And rules can be all sorts of different things, any combinations of source, destination addresses, protocols, ports, any combination of things. So it's very flexible, highly flexible uh, means of establishing security across a network. Basically, firewalls are like a fundamental building block technology around network security. Intrusion detection systems little a little bit newer than firewalls. So firewalls came first. Intrusion detection is um, actually functionality. It is kind of started off as a separate type of technology, which is now being incorporated into firewalls. Basically, what it will do, it will monitor. It will basically evaluate packets. It'll evaluate not just simply packets, but it'll also evaluate content and behaviors and look for what it would, things it would say could potentially be, an intruder. So it's a combination of, it's a combination of a number of things. Some of these things are based upon patterns. Some of these things are based upon behaviors. Some of these things are based upon monitoring. So you've got a whole bunch of different kinds of technologies that come into play with this intrusion detection. But the idea is being able to, have an ongoing checking of traffic and trying to identify either behaviors or sources, or something over and beyond just simply the what you have within a firewall. which is kind of your source destination um, ports and things like that. It's another layer of security over and above um, core firewall functionality. So some of the terms we use and things you want to be aware of. So DMZs, basically a space between, basically a buffer between an internal and the internal and external network, basically delineated by two firewalls. So what happens is you have an external firewall, you have an internal firewall. The space in between is what we call a DMZ, or demilitarizing. Intranet is the protected space. It is TCP/IP. It operates the same way as the internet, um, except that what it is it's protected from the overall internet. So basically, access to the intranet is managed and controlled through firewalls. All right. You can come in using VPN. You can provide access from an intranet. From the internet through an intranet using a virtual private network or a VPN. Um, Extranet is basically a shared intranet space between multiple organizations, controlled by authentication, authorization, firewalls, things of that nature. VLAN, virtual LAN, is devices that are really, it's designed to split things up by broadcast domains and kind of reducing the spread of traffic. It is not, it, a lot of times people will look at VLANs as a security mechanism. It is not in and of itself a security mechanism. It's actually more of it can be used as a security mechanism, but it is not intrinsically secure. Basically, it controls broadcast, so it's not really from a design perspective, a network design. You leveraging basically building VLANs into it at the expectation of providing really secured access is you know, probably needs a higher level over and above that. And then tunneling, the ability to be package um, through a firewall, access through a firewall on a secured across a secured path. That's what we refer to as a tunnel. Talk about issues with data link layers. Some different things to be watched out. MAC address overflows, or Wi-Fi address. You have to be careful sometimes. MAC addresses um, can be exploited. So MAC addresses can be used as a type of security mechanism, similar to an IP address. They can also be subject to as an attack vector. So you really have to be careful about not being totally dependent upon using MAC addresses. 802.11 Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi, when it first came out, 802.11, like most stuff on the internet or networking, really didn't have a lot of security in it. As a matter of fact, it was it was actually a fairly, it had some security mechanisms, but were fairly, I won't say ineffective, but they weren't necessarily up to the rigor needed to adequately provide security. And the risk you run with 802.11 is anybody. It's a radio signal, so anybody who can pick up radio signals could potentially be attacking It could be can potentially leverage that. So the idea is, you could do things like, if you put a wireless device behind the firewall, basically you've turned the firewall is now infinite. All right. So the idea is what you want to do is you have to make sure that you design your wireless networks in such a way so you protect your firewalls, so your firewalls are not compromised by a wireless connection. So a couple things that were originally there. So WEP uh, was actually the original wired equivalency protocol. Was the first wireless protocol. Basically, it was a very it was determined it was breakable. It was not. So as we say here, it's better than no protection at all, but it's not really adequate. It's considered now not to be adequate protection. Now, the modern approach is what we call WPA, Wi-Fi Protected Access. Um, so it uses dynamically changes keys and longer keys, which make it much more secure than WEP. And you can do, as I said, you can also use Mac as an approach on that as well. But it really needs to be done in concert with other types of security like WPA. And that is it for topic 7.